Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. We're having some issues getting the link out to everyone. So if you have um, if you have friends who wanted to be here, send them the live stream link. I'm currently working on sending an email out in batches. We just way more people registered for this than we're expecting. So that's a good problem to have, but we're trying to it all get the link dispersed. Hey, Lincoln.
Hey, Olivia.
Um,
Yeah,
so we're waiting on people to join. Um, we have some folks in here, and I'm just still working on getting the link distributed. So I think we can hang tight for another couple minutes. Um,
that sounds good.
all right. Um, I think we can go ahead and get started, and I will keep sending the link out um, on my end. But I think you can get started with your presentation, and then people will filter in. I think I've I've dispersed the link enough. Um, and I will keep trying to email it out. So let me see how many people we have on here. Okay, we've got 101 people watching now, and more will join. So yeah, I guess I'll just say thank you so much for agreeing to do this workshop, Lincoln. Lincoln works with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Um, and I will let you introduce yourself and say anything else you want to say, and then move on with your presentation.
That sounds good. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So yes, thank you all for joining tonight, and or if you're watching this afterwards. But my name is Lincoln Rice. I'm for the last 5.5 years, I've been the coordinator for the National War Tax Resistance Committee, which we call NUTRIC for short. I've been a war tax resistor since 1998 and involved in different capacities, volunteering for NUTRIC over the years. Um, my undergraduate degree is in accounting, so it's I'm familiar with the field of taxes from a few different perspectives. But tonight I wanted to focus on kind of a general overview of war tax resistance, and then, taking time to answer some questions. I know at the moment I don't have access to the chat, so I'll count on Olivia if you see something that seems pertinent to the slide that we're on. Feel free to interrupt and I can expand. And then obviously at the end, I can answer any questions also.
Sure. And I just want to make sure people on the Zoom on the live stream can see your screen that you're sharing, because I'm kind of looking at it right now and it looks like it might not be there. Hold on.
Okay. I
Sorry.
know there's usually a lag, but it would seem by now it should be up.
Right. Um, oh, people are saying yes, they can see it. Great. Yay.
Perfect. Thank you for letting us know.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
All right. So wanted to, just some minor, well, I don't know, I won't say minor, important disclaimers, that some methods of war tax resistance are not legal, and anyone who attempts them should be prepared to face the risks of civil disobedience. So for those who practice the ways that are not legal, it is a form of civil disobedience or civil resistance. Government laws and policies are subject to change and may not in the future match what our historical experience with them has been. But, what I'm hoping to bring tonight is, what is the law regarding certain methods of war tax resistance, but also in practice, how has the IRS actually responded? And so this, NUTRIC's been around for over 40 years now, but it was started by war tax resistant, mainly local war tax resistance groups who have been practicing it going all the way back to just the end of World War II. So there's decades and decades of accrued wisdom and knowledge here. So war tax resistance counselors like myself don't give tips on how to fudge, cheat, or employ gimmicks to reduce taxes or avoid taxes. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. And normally, depending on who is giving this presentation, someone might say I'm not an accountant. I happen to be an accountant, but I'm not a financial advisor or a lawyer, though over the decades we've had legal counsel when there have been more difficult questions that we weren't sure of how to interpret the law exactly. We've had lawyers who have been kind enough to offer their advice and sometimes provide services for us pro bono. So it's not, intended to be that. It's just more to share stories of resistance and help people decide what's best in their own situation. So I had already said this. Nutric is a coalition of groups. So maybe just to be clear, there's local groups in the Bay, the San Francisco area, the LA area, the New York area, the Milwaukee area. So there are different war tax resistance groups all around the United States. But Nutric is a coalition of those groups. It's not like those groups aren't franchises of Nutric. It's more that Nutric was created by them and is at their service to be kind of a clearinghouse of information and a way for people to touch base and share information. So, why are people interested in war tax resistance? I think obviously the number one reason that there's a increased interest during these last few weeks is because of the weapons being used in Gaza that are funded by the United States. But for those of us who've been practicing war tax resistance for decades, or even just a few years, it usually just has to do more broadly with a militarized United States. So, to put these things in perspective, the United States spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. And we can see here kind of a just before COVID diagram of what each country spends aggregated around the world on their militaries and on military related expenses. And as you can see, the United States spends far more than anyone else. Additionally, the IRS has never passed an audit. So, there are times where we don't exactly know where all the money is going. And there's the money that the US spends abroad, but there's also the military tactics and weapons that come home through local police, local and state police departments, known as the 1033 program. This just kind of puts it in a slightly different perspective. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is put out every year by the War Resisters League. They have a couple folks there that just comb through the president's proposed budget every spring and really look at what lines in the budget are military related and what lines are not military related. And so groups like the War Resisters League and also the National Priorities Project pretty consistently say that anywhere from 43 to about 50% of the federal income taxes are used for military expenses. It's shrunk a little bit the last couple of years because of COVID, but like I said, this budget didn't account for military spending. That'll probably be continuing to support the Israeli military. So kind of putting that all together with other reasons that many people become war tax resistors, there's the military budget, border militarization, federal prisons, impact on the environment. The US military is the #1 institutional user of oil in the world. And climate agreements like the Paris Climate Accord actually exempt militaries from being a part of climate goals. So it's going to be difficult to meet any climate goals if militaries aren't part of that. And here, this is a tank through the 1033 program that the US military provided the Lakeland Police Department in Lakeland, Florida. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if I get asked about the history of war tax resistance, my most common response is that if we have enough history about a civilization, we usually know of an instance of war tax resistance. Here, I'll just mention the first one. The earliest recorded example that we know in what's now today known as the United States is from 1637, when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes for the building of a Dutch fort. But obviously, there's many other examples, from Thoreau to Gandhi to many people joining the war tax resistance during the Vietnam War. And lastly, I'll mention, people might not be as familiar with this, but during the last two years, there have been millions of people in Myanmar, also known as Burma, refusing to pay their utility bills as a way to defund the military regime. So after the military coup happened there, the military, one of the main ways it funds itself is through the public utility. So millions of people have refused to pay that and then had the result of having soldiers come to their homes to demand payment. So, the risk for people in Myanmar practicing war tax resistance is much greater than at least the historical risk in the United States. And so, which tax resistance method is right for you? In one, I mean, some people consider this, it could be a big positive about war tax resistance or a big negative. On the negative side, it could be war tax resistance is so complicated. I never fill out my taxes anyways. I have someone else fill them out. But the positive aspect or the other way of looking at it is depending on your situation, there are a lot of different ways to practice war tax resistance. And so there's a lot of ways to adapt a war tax resistance to a situation that maybe works best for you. And part of how someone might adapt it is based on their goals, risk tolerances, their values, their life situation, um, things of that method, things of that sort. So kind of now getting to the brass tacks, kind of all that background, how to resist taxes. So there are many ways to resist, but the two most common ways are one is that you refuse to pay some or all of your income taxes that you owe. So some people might do a symbolic amount. They want to keep the risk low. Maybe they refuse $100 or $500 or $1,000 and include a letter. Then some may file or some may not file. Others may choose to earn less than the taxable income limit. Right now, that's around $13,000. So that would be the legal method. And for some folks, that might go hand in hand with their views of trying to consume less and having more of a gentle impact on the earth. But again, so there's the legal method and then there's the civil disobedience method. And just there's a picture of what we consider in our movement to be the 5 founders of modern war tax resistance after World War II. Those folks really laid the groundwork, and their initial war tax resistance really came out of seeing the destruction of nuclear weapons used by the United States and knowing that the United States was going to be just spending more and more money on that as the years continued. So if you're an employee and federal income taxes are automatically withheld from your paycheck, there is what we call W-4 resistance. So this isn't an option in many countries. And if you're in Canada or you're in most European countries, if you work as an employee, your first day on the job, they don't give you a W-4 form to decide how much should be removed from your paycheck. The government has a protocol for what should be removed from your paycheck, and there's nothing you can do about it. For whatever reason, in the United States, they ask the employee, how much do you want removed from your paycheck? And so most people maybe only fill this form out every time they have a new job. But it's something that you can ask to resubmit anytime you want, though there might be a 2 to 3 week allowed adjustment before you'd actually see it reflected in your next paycheck or direct deposit. So I don't want to go through W-4 resistance in detail because it can be complicated, or it's looking at tax forms can make some people's eyes go dizzy, but essentially it's increasing the number of deductions that you have. Your W-4 is supposed to somewhat mirror your 1040 that you file at the end of the year. So your employer already knows what your earned income, what your income will be for the whole year. And then you put in the amount of deductions, and it's, your employer's computer will then determine how much should be removed. But we do have some easy resources, a flyer, a video, and a more detailed little booklet on the Nutric website at nwtrcc.org/W4. So if that kind of falls in your wheelhouse, I'd recommend checking out that information. So the positive about this is like now with it being November, if you happen to readjust your W-4 this week, for your taxes that you'll owe on April 15th, you'll only see if most of your taxes were already being withheld. Now you might see that if by the time April 15th rolls around, perhaps you only owe $400, let's say. But this gives you the option of when April 15th rolls around, if you actually want to pay that, let's say $400. So the act of, though this is an act of resistance in itself, and is something that the IRS could fine, or according to the law, they could actually send a person to prison for 12 months for falsifying their W-4. But I believe the last time they criminally prosecuted someone for filling out their W-4 as in a resistance manner was 1975. So they did this a few times in the early 70s. They prosecuted a few times for this in the early 70s, but it only seemed to raise awareness of this method. And so they stopped. Now it's their preferred method is to try to collect the money on the other end, or in some instances, contact your employer and change your W-4 for you. But the likelihood of facing any criminal prosecution for changing your W-4 is unlikely. The other thing is, let's say you're not sure about war tax resistance period, but you adjust your W-4 like so that you don't get a refund at least at the end of the year. At least with this method, you're not giving the government a zero interest loan for sometimes more than a year. Your taxes that are withheld in January won't be refunded to you till more than a year later in the next year. So this is a method that at the very least you could stop giving a free loan, but it does push off whether you still want to practice war tax resistance until April 15th. If you're self-employed, so you work as a contractor or a consultant, depending if you're working for like a corporation or a company, they may give you a W-9 to fill out, which is essentially you put down your name and your social security number and address, and then at the end of the year, they'll send you a W-9 form. So they don't remove any federal income taxes. If you're self-employed, you're supposed to pay that in. And then the same is true with Social Security and Medicare. So with the previous method of W-4 resistance, that only affects your regular federal income taxes. It doesn't affect Social Security and Medicare withholdings. If you're self-employed, some war tax resistors also refuse to pay Social Security and Medicare because almost every president since the 70s has borrowed from it at some time to pay for a war. But my experience is many war tax resistors I know will just pay in their Social Security and Medicare and refuse to pay all or a portion of the rest. And then that way they still qualify for Social Security and will still receive that later. But if you're self-employed, it's much easier and there's much greater latitude with practicing war tax resistance because there's no interaction with an employer. And then there's obviously, if you're, let's say, a carpenter and you mainly work for families, then there's no W-9, there's no 1099. Your income is essentially invisible to the IRS. And then it's up to you if you feel like reporting it at the end of the year or not. So that brings us kind of to the next topic of filing taxes versus not filing. So whether you're going to be seen or whether you might be more hidden. So there's a number of reasons why someone may choose one or the other. It's definitely a personal decision. For filing, you know that you'll be sending in forms that are accurate. For many people, they enjoy, I don't know, maybe enjoy isn't the right word, but they like this is where they can send in a letter that will probably be at least looked at by someone. If you send a letter to a congressperson, you don't know if anyone actually ever looks at it or reads it. But here, it'll probably be put in your file. You can file a protest and it'll be put in your file. It does make collection easier because you're letting the IRS know that you owe money that you're refusing to pay. And if you're working somewhere, you're opening yourself up to an easier time having yourself garnished. One of the main positives with this method is once your taxes are assessed, once your tax debt is assessed, which normally happens shortly after you file. So once the IRS processes your tax forms, then the debt is assessed at that time. And that begins the 10-year statute of limitations. So after 10 years of that assessment, the IRS can no longer try to collect it through their civil arm, which does garnishments and levies, or through their criminal arm through any sort of prosecution. The one exception to this would be if someone filed in um, lied on their tax forms. So if you understated your income, or if you weren't truthful in filling out your taxes, there is no statute of limitation on tax fraud. As long as you fill out your tax forms accurately, it begins the 10-year statute of limitations. The other advantage is it does make it easier to apply for scholarships. So college scholarships for one's children. It's not a deal breaker if you don't file, but again, it does make it easier because FAFSA likes to verify your income through tax forms. And the Obamacare health insurance subsidies actually require that you file. So if you don't file, you won't qualify for those for those for Obamacare if you need to be on Obamacare. When it comes to not filing, so this would be you don't send in your forms. We'd still recommend filling out your forms in case the IRS does catch up to you at some point. The IRS, if they do catch up with you, they'll file on your behalf, and they'll always file so that the tax is greater than it actually is. They won't file to your benefit. So if for some reason you do become collectible, you'll want to dispute how much they say you owe. So please fill out your tax forms anyways, even if you're not going to file. This does make collection harder. The IRS is so understaffed, especially since around 2010. There's still the Tea Party influence where the IRS was defunded and has since then has lost over a third of their workforce. So catching up with folks who don't file is very difficult. It's how they decide which ones to go after and which ones that they don't have the time. We really don't know. They don't share that information, but it does make collection harder, and they often don't catch up to people who don't file. There's essentially no statute of limitations until the IRS files for you. So if they do decide to, assign someone to your case and file tax forms on your behalf, it's once they file on your behalf and assess your tax debt that the statute of limitations begins. And there is an additional penalty. It doesn't increase it that much more than if you were filing, but if you thought you might be collectible, they might end up getting more money in the end from some additional penalties. Maybe I'll just pause there for a moment. And I don't know if Olivia, if there's any questions or anything in the chat that seems relevant for now to touch base on.
Um, the only thing I'm seeing is somebody asking if there's somewhere we can find the slideshow online.
Mm.
Is there?
Not at the moment, but within the next couple of days, I'll put a link to it on the homepage of the Nutric website. So the nwtrcc.org, there's some general links there, and I'll make sure to put a link to it there probably tomorrow.
And also this video will be archived on this YouTube account. So we can revisit it and send it out. Somebody wants some elaboration on garnishments and levies.
I'll be getting to that, but it's
Okay, great.
perfect. So I'll cover some myths of war tax resistance now. So probably the biggest one is, well, you're going to go to jail. I know I was speaking to a class of college students week and a half ago, and they just couldn't believe I wasn't in jail. The question came up like 3 times in 90 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes. Just even though I explained it each time, I think there was still just some disbelief. So to be clear, somewhat, again, this is where there's the actual law versus the reality of the practice. Simply refusing to pay one's federal income taxes is a criminal offense that could result in jail time. But this has only ever happened to 2 war tax resistors. One was Ernest Bromley, who was on that photo that we saw earlier, and he was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment for refusing to buy a war tax stamp for his car. So granted, that was right at the beginning of World War II. The second one was a bit more recent, and here Tony Serra was sentenced to 10 months in 2005 for willful failure to pay. And the reason we believe that he was singled out is because he's a lawyer. So that would be one of my caveats. If someone is a lawyer, they might want to have a more, they might be open to more risk than a regular person. Because part of proving this case, which the IRS has rarely um, chosen to prosecute, is that someone actually understood that this was the law and they could end up in prison for this. So essentially, since the end of World War II, they've only gone after one person, and that was a lawyer. They're going to take my house, my car, my property. So property seizures are very rare these days, and not just for war tax resistors, just in general. And part of this is a change in philosophy by the IRS. So here, the IRS publishes each year, how many property seizures they performed. They don't always get specific about what kind of property. So, it could be a house, it could be a car, it could be almost anything. But we can see that going back to 1987, like that year, there are around 20,000 pieces of property seized. And up until 1997, the number was around 10,000 items a year. So if you happened at some point touch base with someone who is or was a war tax resistor during the 70s, 80s, or early 90s, there's a good chance that they'll have a story about their car being seized. And in some instances, perhaps a home. There are a few famous instances of that happening. But since this change of philosophy in the late 90s, we've not heard of anyone in our network who's had any piece of property seized. So you can see the number drop substantially. And uh, basically, I think one of the number usually hovers somewhere between like 100 and 400 pieces of property that the IRS takes total throughout the year. So there's just a change of policy there. Again, that could change at some point. And to be clear, like for a house, even though it was rare for them to take a house beforehand, the IRS law on this has been pretty, it doesn't increase for inflation. And the law itself states that if you owe more than $5,000, they can take your home, put it up for auction. And if they receive at auction more than what you owe, they'll just give you the rest of the balance. But again, it's pretty rare, even back in the 90s or 80s, for someone to have their home taken who simply owed $5,000. It was usually something reserved for people who owed more and to make an example of them. Another myth, well, they're just going to end up getting the money anyways. And so the IRS doesn't release these numbers regularly. So this is kind of the last year that I'm aware of that we have these numbers for. So they're a few years old, but they were released maybe in 2019. But in any case, so we see on the left what the IRS believes it should be earning in taxation, and on the right, what they taxes actually paid. And so for the year that this was done, the IRS believed that there was a tax gap of nearly $500 billion. According to the IRS's own estimates, they believed that when all is said and done, they'll probably end up collecting about 50 billion of the $500 billion, which is about 10%. So at the end of the day, they do collect on some people. And if you practice illegal war tax resistance, there is a chance, there's always a chance you could be one of those people, but it's definitely not automatic. The vast majority of people who don't pay, and obviously most of them aren't doing it for reasons of war tax resistance, but whether you're a war tax resistor or not, most people don't end up paying, at least not all of what they owed. Another myth, war tax resistors don't pay for things our society needs. And so one thing that would make war tax resistors different than people who are just trying to evade their taxes is there's a philosophy of redirecting one's federal income taxes. So for example, I believe is so there's war tax resistors will sometimes get together in groups. There's one in the New England area and one in the San Francisco Bay area that are perhaps the most noted for this, that they'll pool their money together and do granting ceremonies around tax day to raise awareness that there are areas, people, groups that are underfunded that are not receiving the funds that they need to do the important work that they're doing. So like some people do it on a more individual level. For myself, I'll usually take the funds that I'm refusing to pay and redirect them to, there's a local immigrant rights group here. There's I'm in touch with certain prisoners that, prison conditions are obviously not ideal. And so putting extra money into their accounts so that things can at least be a little nicer during the year. There are different groups that work with the homeless here. And so it's an opportunity to share those funds, because I think part of the thought is also, let's say this year I'm only resisting, well, depending on, it could be only, or it could be a lot of $2,000. That $2,000 is probably almost nothing to the US government and the military. But if you're redirecting that to a local group, that could be a major boost for them and allow them to do something that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So what are the actual risks? So while many war tax resistors simply get a stream of letters, there are other possible risks. And letters, especially if you file, letters you'll receive many, especially if you do it for more than 1 year. For myself, I'm married, and so they want to make sure that my spouse knows. And so every year I'll receive a letter for each of the 10 years that I still owe, and my spouse will receive a letter for each of the 10 years that we still owe. So there'll come a day where we open the mailbox and there's 20 letters from the IRS. And even now my heart still skips a little bit of a beat, because I think we're just ingrained in the United States to fear the IRS, and they're just computer generated letters. But the IRS knows these letters are powerful. When it comes to that tax gap we were talking about, for people who do end up paying, half of the people that end up paying a tax debt that they refuse to pay for some reason, half of those people that pay do it simply because of a generated letter, a computer generated letter. So it is their most effective tool, even though it's just a computer sending it out. So other possible risks: salary or Social Security garnishment. So if you are an employee, at some point they might send a wage garnishment to your employer. And then at that point, there's a formula that your employer will be given that'll explain to them how much you can take home. So for instance, if you're single with no children, that number is around $1,200 of take home per month, but it is after everything else has been taken out of your paycheck. So if you pay for, if you put in for healthcare, if you put in for retirement, anything that gets taken out, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So you might make your own voluntary contribution to your retirement. After all of those things have been taken out, then you're still allowed actual take home of around $1,100 to $1,200 a month. If you're married, that doubles. And for each child you have, that number also goes up. So depending on someone's lifestyle, that could either be a minor inconvenience or a major hurt. And then as long as someone's still at that job, they'll keep collecting until the tax debt is paid. I refer to this oftentimes as the reverse lottery. It happens to people. I'll hear about, one or two people a year in our network for whom their salary is garnished, but the vast majority, especially in the last 10 plus years, it just doesn't happen. And the IRS has stated themselves that there are millions of individuals who, because they file or they get a W-2 at the end of the year from their employer, they know they owe, they know where they are, and they just don't have the people and resources to send out all those garnishments. Because there's so many scams, the IRS needs to have someone available to answer the phone for questions from employers to make sure it's legitimate. So they'll only send out as many garnishments as they have people to answer the questions by employers, and the rest fall through the cracks. One that is more certain and does happen to almost everyone who's a war tax resistor is a Social Security garnishment. I think because it's just another government agency, the tax debt that you owe when you start owing Social Security, um, probably shortly after one would start receiving Social Security, the IRS will start garnishing 15%. So they're allowed to take 15%. There are a few instances where they've taken more, but it requires a lot more paperwork on their end. And it's usually perhaps you have someone who's actually assigned to your case that doesn't like you. But often with this 15%, it's all done by computers. There's no one on your case. So unless you're having antagonistic interactions with the IRS, it would probably just be that 15%. And if you were lower income, you could make an argument to lower that to zero. Uh, bank seizures, bank account seizures are also possible. Um, Again, it's very rare, but it does happen. To try to make this possibility more rare, many war tax resistors might keep their funds in a non-interest bearing credit union or bank account. If your funds are in a interest bearing bank account and you have $10 or more of interest during the year, you should receive a 1099 income form, and that means the IRS is also receiving one. But if you're in a non-interest bearing account, then the IRS doesn't get that info and they don't know that you have a bank account somewhere. Kind of I usually refer to the 80s and the early 90s as the olden days. In the olden days, when they had more people on to actually work on people's cases, they might actually like call banks within a 2 mile radius of your home to see if you had an account there. But I haven't heard of this happening in the last 20 years. The way a bank account seizure works is the moment your bank opens the letters stating that you owe and they're putting a hold on the account, your account will be frozen for 21 days. This is for many the biggest inconvenience. Because even let's say your bank account has $10,000 and you only owe $1,000, your whole $10,000 will be frozen for 21 days. It's supposed to be for your benefit. And it's to give you 21 days to dispute whether they should take the money out at the end of the 21 days. So for this reason, many war tax resistors also have more than one bank account, just in case one of their bank accounts would get frozen, they would have access to it otherwise. The other thing is they only have access to seize the money that's there the moment this bank levy is opened. If let's say you work and you have direct deposit, if money was put in your account the day after the levy showed up, they wouldn't be able to seize that money. So even let's say you only had $2, we'll say you had $200 in your bank account, a levy shows up for 1,000. The day after the levy, you put in $1,000. They could only take the 200 that was already in your account the day before. They can't take any money that's deposited later. And the money you deposit later is not supposed to be frozen either. But, a bank may or may not always be familiar with all the intricacies of the law here. State refund seizure. This actually has happened to me where I accidentally paid into my home state a little, maybe I was supposed to get a refund of $140 and the IRS had a levy waiting there and they took that money at the end of the year. So now I'm more careful when I'm paying into my state taxes also. There is interest and penalties. So if you are collectible, that is something to be aware of. I need to look up the exact numbers on that, but I think essentially I want to say it's like 1.5% a month compounding up to a max of 25%. It's right around there. So, one's tax debt can grow over, if you're filing over the 10 years that you owe that debt. And if you were collected right at the end, you would end up paying more. Loss of health insurance subsidies. So I put this here. There was a case of someone when the IRS now is finally caught up with their backlog of paper filings. So there was someone who they did file paper tax form, and the IRS at one point was almost a year behind in processing, and their state healthcare, the state agency that ran the healthcare subsidies had checked with the IRS and thought she hadn't filed. And so she temporarily lost her healthcare subsidies. When she called back and said, I did file, they just haven't processed it yet. The state put her back on. So, but if you're a non-filer, you could lose your health insurance subsidies, even if you don't lose them immediately. There can be difficulty in getting student loans. The student loan people don't care if you pay your taxes or not, but for many, they feel that they're more certain about what your income is if they can verify it through IRS filed forms. So this is where the difficulty can be. So you'd need to be able to prove to them in another way that they feel comfortable that your income is what you say it is. So two last ones here that are likely, or could happen. A public lien. So it usually happens once you hit about the $20,000 mark. If once your tax debt reaches $20,000, the IRS will probably send a letter to you and your local county courthouse saying that there's a notice of a public lien for the amount of your tax debt. Where this would have a practical effect is if you're a homeowner and you're going to sell, that type of transaction would go through the county courthouse. The bank from the person who might be buying your home would check this before writing you a check. And so they would, skim off what they owe before you would receive the proceeds. The other thing that went into effect in 2018 was for people who have what the IRS considers a large tax debt. At this point, it's $59,000, but it goes up usually $1,000 a year. So at this point, if you owe more than $59,000, you won't be able to renew your passport. You won't lose your current passport, but you wouldn't be able to renew it or get a new one. So for someone who either loves to travel or needs to travel for work, this would be something that you'd want to be aware of. Whether this law is legal or not, I'm not sure. I've followed a number of court cases. And even the judges themselves, when they speak on it, don't seem totally convinced by the law. But most people who've appealed this from the IRS have usually represented themselves and haven't had adequate legal counsel. So in one case, when it was appealed, one of the 3-court panel of judges stated that if they had gone down this road to defend their stand on, that they think it would have been more fruitful. So we'll see. That could be ruled unconstitutional in the coming years. Just to continue, what are the actual risks? Or we're nearing the end here, but maybe it was shortly after Biden was elected president. He's been kind of working hand in hand with the IRS and had a very positive relationship. And they passed a bill to fund the IRS to the tune of $80 billion over the next 10 years. This has already been cut into during some of the bills to raise the debt ceiling. In order to get these things passed, the compromise with the Republican House has been to kind of gut most of the money that's been going to them so far. But if this actually does happen, which is up for debate, this would increase the IRS budget by 60% each year. It would double their workforce, and oddly, it'd bring their budget to where it was about 10 years ago. So we can see their budget has just been gutted over the last 10 years. And 10 years ago, they truthfully at that point weren't that effective. So really they were more effective in the 80s and 90s. Over the last 20 years, they've not been very effective. And so even if Biden's dream comes true and he's able to really refund the IRS, it'll be to a level where there'll be maybe a few more garnishments and a few more levies, but not that many more than usual. They also here is a picture of when they were way behind on their paper tax forms. So they're also some of the money that they still are able to get that they haven't compromised away is going for just basic operations, taxpayer services, and technology upgrades because their technology as it currently stands is almost 20 years old. You can tell if you have gotten a letter from the IRS in the past, you can tell like this was not printed by a new computer. Like this is old school. So lastly here, Nutric is here as a resource. We want to be helpful and please, our website is extensive. So it's something someone can get lost in. We try to make organize it as in as helpful a way as possible so that people can kind of look at what would pertain to them. But we have lots of resources there. We have a newsletter that comes out every 2 months. We have a paper edition, but also an electronic email edition. On page 2 of that newsletter, when I'm following things like the passport law, or if someone has let me know that their wages were garnished, excuse me, I'll always put all those things on page 2. There's kind of some notes about the IRS and our network, and so there's stories about people, but also general notes of what is happening with the IRS that could affect war tax resistors. Um, we organize or at least make a list of tax day activities that local groups are doing. If you're connected to a group that would like to have a workshop like this, reach out to me. My phone number is there. The 262 number and the 800 number go to the same phone, and the email goes to me. So feel free to contact me if you'd like something like this, or maybe to connect with a war tax resistor in your area. Then I have my last slide here. So just some general resources. Again, our newsletter, there's the W-4 form, which is kind of a way to get into war tax resistance if you're an employee. We have by state what we call our counselors list. So these are people who have been war tax resistors usually for a few years, but then went through a training to kind of make sure that they're familiar with more situations than just their own and can help people. We use the term non-directively counsel. So they're not there to kind of tell you this is what you do. They're there to listen and to hear what your situation is and what you're hoping to accomplish, and then let you know the different ways that you could practice war tax resistance if you're still interested in the risks, but also what risks could be associated with all of those. There's a link to our email sign up. And then lastly, there's also they're kind of a group related, but not technically part of Nutric, called the War Tax Resistance Penalty Fund. They're a group of war tax resistors that essentially it's a mutual aid society. So they haven't been that busy lately because there really has been almost no one who's been garnished. But if someone does get garnished or a levy on their bank account or something along those lines, they'll send out, or when it was more common, they'd send out on a quarterly basis a newsletter to everyone who's part of the group and say something to the effect, if everyone pitched in $10, we could at least reimburse this person for all the penalties and fines and interest. So that way, at least if someone is collected upon, they don't have to deal with that kind of the double whammy of not just having their income taxes taken out, which they may have already redirected somewhere, but the extra interest and penalties, they'll reimburse the interest and penalties. So at least you're only stuck with dealing with what you lost that you owed in your original tax debt. So I'll stop there for now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lincoln. That was a lot of really great information. We do have a bunch of questions, some of them philosophical and some of them technical. So I was thinking we could start with the more philosophical, broader ones first and then move into the technical. Does that sound all right?
Sure.
Um, so there's like there's an infographic circulating that I think a lot of our viewers have seen that basically people are asking that about like how if military funding, just like the government will always be able to have more money for war, basically. Um, People are saying that like taxes don't directly fund the military, and so how does this function if that's the case? Yeah, I was wondering what you have to say to that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have seen on like TikTok videos or on our Instagram, or I'll see this type of comment from time to time. And it's, I mean, in one sense, it starts to make sense with the federal government can always print more money, so it doesn't really matter if you pay your taxes. But if there was a critical mass of people who were refusing to pay their federal income taxes, and the IRS or the federal government, made up for this deficit just by printing more money, it would deflate the dollar. And planes, nuclear weapons, even cluster bombs, all these things are extremely expensive. And so the IRS, sorry, the federal government can't simply just print money if people aren't paying their federal income taxes, because it would deflate the dollar, it would kill the economy here in the United States. And, so that's why this is important as an action. And it's something that the IRS has realized is important. And it's why during World War I and World War II, um, they would have people go around giving shows to get people to buy war bonds. So it is, nowadays they kind of figured, why put our time into trying to collect money voluntarily through war bonds? They just decided to raise the income tax. But in the past, you know, they would raise money in that manner. And so that's why, granted, it was a while ago, but Henry David Thoreau went to jail because he wouldn't pay, it wasn't just a regular income tax. He was supposed to pay a tax specifically for the Mexican American War. And so this is something that um, that is important to the federal government. And we may I'll just add one last bit to this. Sometimes people dispute, well, I don't know if it really is 40 to 50% of federal income taxes really go for war. What about Social Security? Like if you go to your library, you might still see like an actual paper 1040 form booklet, like how to fill it out. And when you first open it up, there's this pie chart. And it'll look like perhaps the United States only spends like 17 to 20% on the military, and a huge portion is Social Security and Medicare, which are really separate taxes. They're not those taxes that are due on April 15th. They're collected separately on your paycheck. They're more of a trust fund. And up until the Vietnam War, those Medicare and Social Security weren't included on your 1040 in your 1040 booklet on the pie chart, because even the IRS and the federal government viewed those as separate taxes. But as the Vietnam War escalated, and people could look in their booklet that they got before paying their taxes and see that the military budget was nearing 50%. It actually helped fuel war tax resistance. So it was at that point that the federal government had the IRS change the pie chart so that it would shrink the war budget and make people more willing to pay their federal income taxes for war.
That's wild. Yeah, I think the way I've been thinking about this, and I'm not sure if this is correct, but like it can be seen as a form of striking. Like a while ago, a few years ago, there was talk of a debt strike. I know some groups are still talking about debt striking. Um, so it can be seen as a form of striking, and adding like a material emphasis behind social dissent. And whether or not like I think I I have this image in my mind of like a big pot of money that says war, and like if we don't put enough money into it, then like the government can't go to war. Like obviously that's not the case, but they still want our money. Um, and so it'll have an impact regardless. Is that a decent way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I think so. And even, now with the increased interest, we could see a different reaction than we've seen the last 20 years from the federal government and the IRS. And again, that's why we always keep our resources up to date so that people can know if there's any change by the IRS. But, over the last 20 plus years I've been practicing war tax resistance, I feel like, you know, the money that I've resisted still doesn't nearly add up to like one jet fighter. But all those thousands of dollars that I've redirected to other organizations, I know it's made a huge impact on them. And so, and they wouldn't have had that money otherwise. So I know in that sense, it has a direct impact now, and hopefully over the long haul might also, like be a strike act that might affect how the US population and the federal government think about war making.
Right. Yeah. And I think there are a couple other questions in here about seeing this as like trying to organize this more collectively. I think most of the war tax resistors I've known in my life have done it as like an individual moral choice and not done it on this like large scale organized um, platform. And I'm not sure um, how like if your organization sees itself as doing that. But there are some questions in here about like if that's been done before, organized as a collective action, like around tax season or around some like filing date. Yeah, obviously any statement is stronger when it's coming from masses of people.
Usually the way that Nutric is set up is more as I stated, my title is the coordinator of Nutric, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. And if it was another organization, my title might be director, executive director, but I'm because of the nature of us being a coalition of smaller groups, it does make organizing on the larger level slower. And so, but if there's, we definitely are supportive of local groups. We'll always promote what they're doing, or if there's some national group that wants to make war tax resistance, if someone was going to launch a campaign, we would definitely be promoting it and make people aware of it. And depending on it, it's something that we could bring up with our group. Again, we work by consensus. We send out an email to everyone in our network, and we see how the responses come back over a couple of weeks. So again, it's much slower, but I don't always know if that's necessary for the federal government, to realize that this is happening. The where you have maybe the most direct impact with federal lawmakers is with your local lawmaker for your local district. So, if there was a group of, let's say, 200 people in that area that were willing to be public and, meet with the local congressperson, I think that would have more of an effect than if there were, I don't know, 10,000 people nationally that send a letter to President Biden who's not going to read it. But, if it's locally, I think it might have more of an impact on how that congressperson might decide to vote. Um, but I will, the other part is um, it is difficult for people to be public, for many people to be public about it. There's just such a fear that even if they sign their name to a petition that says they're going to be a war tax resistor or might consider war tax resistance if this doesn't stop, something doesn't stop. Um, People are afraid to put their name there just because they believe the IRS is sitting and waiting. Now, the NSA, I'm sure there are federal organizations that collect all that information and then it goes somewhere where probably not much usually happens. But this is where it's important to remember the IRS. Each federal agency really is its own little kingdom and they don't like to share with each other. And so this is the part where I think a lot of people are like, well, can't the IRS just like on one of those like CSI, someone gets on a computer and they see where every bank account is. And probably the NSA can do that, but the IRS doesn't have the budget or people. And they usually do kind of follow the law with that sort of thing. So the IRS doesn't know a lot about you. They mostly know what you share with them voluntarily.
Right. Yeah, I think it is important to remember. I've been reminded during this presentation that our federal government is very dysfunctional. Um, but yeah, I think it's also a thing where like it's a free country until like people start to pose an actual threat. And like we've seen, I'm thinking about like in Atlanta, like people getting charged with like RICO charges and other crazy stuff for posing a threat to the Cop City project. And so I think like there aren't crackdowns on this right now. And if it were to happen on a larger scale, like there might be more crackdowns. So I think that's just something else to keep in mind. Um, we can move on to some more technical questions because I know there are some of those, if that's all right.
Sure.
Um, okay, let me see. So somebody is asking, um, if I'm self-employed, W-9 only, and have an accountant do my paperwork for me and only want to pay Social Security slash Medicare, I basically wait to see what those values are first before paying. And should I avoid paying quarterly taxes and not pay them until I know what the Social Security slash Medicare values are during tax season?
Um, I think if you want, you could pay quarterly, as you might be aware. If you if you're not paying you're just your regular quarterly income taxes, the IRS may assign you a fine for not paying in enough during the year, but it's usually on the very low end, and it only affects you if you're a collectible. Um, but I know when I've been self-employed, I've usually paid quarterly for my um, Medicare and Social Security because I usually had an idea of what it was. And the last payment isn't due. The next payment, which is the last payment for 2023, is, I believe, January 15th. And, by you may or may not know exactly what it is by then. Um, you might not have had a chance to fill out your tax forms to see the exact number, but you could even just send it in. Um, you could send it in later in January. They have an official due date, but if you send it in late, no one cares. They're just glad you sent it in. Um,
Gotcha.
but I do find it helpful. I think it might be helpful to actually, especially to send it in um, with it being clear that it's for that, and then it will get credited to your statement that I think you get it every 2 years that shows what you've paid into Social Security. So it will get credited there. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I get the sense that they're more accurate in their accounting for your Social Security pay-ins if it's kind of done separately than if it's sent in on April 15th.
Gotcha. Okay. That's good to know. I'm also in that situation. Um, Another question is it better or safer to not file at all versus filing and omitting income? This person is using Airbnb income as an example, which would be more likely pursued or would have the worst potential penalties. In other words, what are the risks of omitting, which could be considered fraud?
If you were going to omit and you thought there was at all a chance the IRS might discover that you omitted the funds, then if you're going to file, I would rather file the whole amount. Because, like I said, that is with the IRS's um, limited resources. They will they'll use those limited resources to criminally prosecute those who file fraudulent forms. With not filing, you're leaving the door open for them to come in the future. So it kind of depends. I must admit, I've usually been a filer just because I like having that final due date where I know, like, you know, after and it's been nice being a war tech sister now for 25 years. 15 of those years, I've been able to, the year has come and I'm like, this amount is gone. They can't come after that amount anymore. Where for non-filers, there is always that thought that they could catch up with you. And part of it depends on what line of work you're in. If you think you'll be collectible at all in the future, if you might change your line of work. Airbnb income, I know the IRS made a change to um, third party reporting of income, which affects things like um, eBay, PayPal, Venmo. Like if you're receiving kind of business payments through those groups, up until last year, the IRS wouldn't, or those third party groups wouldn't report your income to you or the IRS unless it was at least six, no, at least 200 transactions and over $20,000 of transactions. But starting for this tax year that we're currently in, those groups and organizations are supposed to report if you have business income of over $600. So I'm not sure, I'm not as familiar with Airbnb, how they report, but if you haven't received anything from them in the past, this year, if you receive more than $600 from them, you should be receiving an income form, which then, if you receive it, the 1099 income form, the IRS is also receiving it.
Yeah, and also like if you file, then that gives you a chance to like write your letter and get your message in, even if it's not actually read by anyone. But
And I will say, unless someone, of course, is practicing fraud, one of the added benefits of war tax resistance is the IRS is really just interested in the money. They know if they, in the past, when they used to criminally prosecute more often, especially someone that wasn't practicing fraud and was, um, a person or a family that people sympathized with, it created bad press for the IRS and just raised awareness of this. And so now, since usually it's just the civil arm that would be trying to collect the money, I'd say this is what makes war tax resistance different than, let's say, robbing a bank. So if tomorrow I went and robbed a bank and got away with it, but a week later thought, that I shouldn't have done that, and I go back to the bank and I give back the money, I'm still going to jail. They're going to criminally prosecute me. It doesn't matter. Maybe my sentence will be slightly lighter, but I'm going to jail. With war tax resistance, if it ever got to the point where someone felt uncomfortable, or a spouse felt uncomfortable and there's some sort of compromise that we're going to pay this or set up a payment plan, the IRS is just happy to have the money. And if someone's willing to make a payment plan, if they were maybe thinking of taking someone's house or one of these less common but very scary things that can sometimes happen, um, that's all they want in the end, is the money.
gotcha. Okay. Um, Another question, this is a good one. Does war tax resistance show up on a credit score? Negatively
Mm,
impact if you're trying to apply to rent an apartment, get a loan, buy a car, etc.
thank you. I put that under, that was on the slideshow, and then I never really talked about it. It can, oftentimes when they're doing the filing the federal notice of a federal lien, public notice of a federal lien, when you maybe hit the $20,000 mark, they may also file notice with one or more of the credit reporting agencies. Um, this has happened. It used to be more common. I must admit, in my case, there is a note, like they did a few years ago, file the public notice of a federal lien and let me know and sent it to my local county courthouse. But since then, like every 6 months or so, I check my credit score and it's still like around, I don't know, near 800. It's it's very high. So in my personal experience, it's never affected my credit score, but that doesn't mean that the IRS might start sending out those notices more. They have done it in the past. It just hasn't been a common practice for them lately.
Gotcha. Thank you. Um, Someone's asking if your salary comes from a government grant through a bilateral partnership with an NGO, does this increase the risk of salary garnishment?
Mhm. Um, I don't think it would, because they're not going to be collecting from the federal agency. They're going to be collecting from your most immediate employer. Um, yeah, I don't believe it would, but this is where, if anyone has experience of this, this is where, if I heard of this happening, I'd pass it along, but I haven't heard of it happening. But granted, your situation is more unique.
Mhm. Um, Someone's asking about avoiding penalties by having multiple bank accounts or having money in a family member's bank account.
Mm. So if the IRS, mm, this is where you can get into that gray area, because um, depending on how someone is hiding, quote unquote, hiding money, that could be viewed as a fraudulent act by the IRS. So it's one thing if you just have multiple bank accounts so that it's harder for them to, if to find more than one or even any of them. But if you start having property in someone's else's name, um, that could be viewed as then they view that in a different light. I will say if you had it in your name and someone else's name, it can become much more difficult because I'll say, well, it's uncommon for them. It's kind of a last resort that in some instances they'll go after someone's retirement funds. When they have gone after retirement funds, which they'll treat like a bank account, they're much more likely to go after someone's like 401k than to go after like if someone has oh, what's the term? Like a real if you're working for someone, they actually have like a real retirement where the company pays out. The term is eluding me. But there's those type of retirement accounts where everyone's money who worked at the organization is just pooled together. And it's not like a set amount is yours because when you retire, or a pension, if they're much less likely to try to take money from a pension because how much of the pension is actually yours is more nebulous. And sometimes when you decide to retire and you have a pension, you might choose to get a higher pension because you only get paid out until you die. But if you take a lower pension, you could leave some to your spouse and kids, so it's pension. I'll say pensions are kind of similar to owning homes, let's say a home with someone else that's not a war tax resistor. It becomes more difficult for the IRS to go after those types of um, properties. And there have been cases in most states, if you have one spouse who's a war tax resistor and another who's not a war tax resistor, the home could be owned by the non-war tax resistor and would essentially be shielded. So that would be different because it's not like you're trying to hide it with a friend or a sister or, it's assumed that one of you owns it, if not both of you. Though with the caveat that there are what we call community property states. I'm in one in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, it doesn't, even if I filed separately from my wife, it wouldn't matter because with Wisconsin being a community property state, all assets and all debts accrued by either spouse after the marriage belong to both. So that's 9 states. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but I know it's like Wisconsin, Texas, and then a few, California and Washington, a number of West Coast states. It doesn't seem to depend on if they're Republican or Democrat. It was kind of random. So before you do that, you'd really want to make sure, am I in a community property state or not?
Gotcha. About how much time do you have? Like, how many questions? How many more questions do you have time for?
Um, I don't know, 15 minutes. Does that sound?
Okay, I think we can make that work. Um, Somebody says you mentioned that 10% of tax resistors are found and forced to pay taxes every year. Do you know if the IRS targets those in a certain salary range? And I think this kind of ties to somebody else's question earlier, um, which was to build solidarity and impact of our collective resistance movement, should we be targeting messaging differently towards working class, middle slash professional managerial class, billionaires, elite, et cetera, et cetera?
The first one, did they say 10% of war tax resistors get collected on every year?
Yeah, was that not
They may have
accurate?
said, I don't think so. At least not really. Well, I should take that back. I don't know what the number is. If you include Social Security, which I guess is, I'd have to do a poll. I haven't, I'm not exactly sure if it's 10% or, but when it, even with say 10% of war tax resistors are having their Social Security collected, um, if they were filers, they're only collecting on the amount that they still had a tax debt to collect legally when they started collecting. I'm sorry, could you maybe repeat
Yeah.
the second half?
Basically, they're just asking, does the IRS target people in a certain salary range? And
Um,
like, I guess to summarize the other one, like, should people who are in different salary ranges and different classes be going about this in different ways?
yeah, it's hard to say. Again, at least most people, that are war tax resistors that are I'm in touch with are more either, living very simply to probably middle class, some maybe a few upper middle class. And at least among those folks, I haven't seen that like those who only owe 500 each year or those who owe 10,000 each year. I'm not seeing no one's being targeted by the IRS really. That's again why I've always referred to it as the reverse lottery as of late. But there is the what Biden has been pushing, what the IRS appears to be putting some of its limited resources on is audits, and so they have been definitely critiqued for auditing, uh, especially like poorer Black families. Oddly, even with the earned income tax credit, um, they're targeting a greater portion, a greater proportion of Black families than white families that qualify and make use of the earned income tax credit. No one's exactly sure why, because the IRS doesn't keep race statistics, so it's harder to determine. They say that they're colorblind, um, but the money that they've been receiving, they've for audits, they want to be using that to focus on people who make $400,000 a year or more. And I do think that that's probably what will happen because the IRS knows if Biden stays as president, that'll be better funding for them. And part of one of Biden's kind of campaign promises is to make sure that audits are for these higher wage families. But I'll add, war tax resistors have been rarely audited because usually they file accurately. And the whole purpose of an audit is because the IRS computer flagged you, that something seems strange and they think your filing was inaccurate, either on purpose or not on purpose. But since war tax resistors usually file accurately, it hasn't led to any greater increase in audits for us.
Gotcha. Okay. Um, see. Someone's pointing out the Airbnb is on the BDS list in reference to a previous question. So that's a really good point. And I think anyone in this meeting right now who's thinking about war tax resistance should also be thinking about BDS and practicing it. Um, and they have a great website with a lot of good information. Um, Another question is, I saw something about lobbying for peace tax fund legislation that would allow conscientious objectors to pay taxes to a fund that would be used not for military spending. Wondering if you know anything about this.
Yeah, so it's the piece. I should have it memorized off the top of my head. Um, I want to make sure I give the correct name. There's the National Campaign for a Peace Tax Fund. So they've been around for quite a while and regularly introduced legislation to do exactly what the person who asked the question indicated. Up until his passing recently, Representative John Lewis was a huge supporter of that legislation and regularly introduced it into the committee he was on in Congress. And um, and so Nutric is definitely supportive of this. We are, brother or sister organizations, and but I don't see this as something that would probably happen in the near future. It usually gets very little traction and very few people co-sponsoring the bill. Um, it is, I'd say, for groups that exist, especially in Europe, who are interested in more tax resistance, a lot more of their focus is on this type of legislation since employees don't have any ability to adjust their federal income tax withholding. But for us, since we have the ability to do that, we put more of our focus on, um, letting people know what different options and risks there are. But that, yeah, that group exists, and if people could obviously support them and try to help them out. But I personally don't see that legislation going anywhere in the near future. It's always a nice prod to remind folks on Capitol Hill that, um, conscientious object, if the United States is going to honor conscientious objection, it seems strange that then you would force those people to pay money to pay for the very thing that they wouldn't do with their own bodies.
Right. Yeah. I didn't know about that. That's exciting. I'd get behind it. Um, um, okay. Couple more questions. Um, Someone says, are you saying that as a self-employed person, if I want to war tax resist, I can pay the estimated Social Security slash Medicaid portion and not the estimated rest of my federal taxes? Isn't there still an automatic penalty?
Or there would still be a penalty for depending on how much you're refusing to pay in. There could be a penalty for if the amount that you're refusing to pay in meets their threshold for a percentage of your total taxes that you'd owe for the year. Um, but like I said, it's more on the minor side. And yeah, it's more on the minor side and isn't something I've never heard of anyone saying this, I got hit with this and it was like $3,000, or it's, I want to say usually in the hundreds of dollars from people that I've heard have actually been assessed that fine.
Okay. And somebody's asking, how can you file taxes accurately but not pay? I thought that once you file, they deduct it automatically or find a way
Um,
to.
I must admit, I'm not as familiar with electronic filing, but yeah, normally especially if someone's electronically filing and they owe, they'll probably be inputting their, uh, you know, savings account or checking account information and having it deducted. But when I have talked to electronic filers, I've been told that you don't have to include that information and it'll still allow you to file. But I know personally, I've always been a paper filer, and so that's always the easiest way. And then it also allows someone to send a letter explaining why they're refusing to pay. Um, but yeah, I know someone asked this question not too long ago, and there was an electronic filer on the call who said that they file and don't pay.
That's good to know. I've only done e-filing and I'm gonna have to switch it up. Um, Somebody's asking if there are any tips on finding an accountant that's resistance friendly or could give unbiased advice.
Yeah, I can say as someone who has an accounting degree and has worked as an accountant here and there, um, that I don't, my personal opinion is I don't think it matters. Especially every tax accountant, their whole purpose is to make sure you owe as little as possible. And then especially for your situation, if you're trying to lower your income tax debt, well, Nutric is here as a resource to say, what'll happen if I don't pay this, or what does this, I got this letter and I'm not sure it's just a regular letter. You can call the office or email me and send me a picture, and we can go from there. That's where my resources and expertise lies. But someone who stays up to date, who still does tax preparation all the time, they're the ones that she could say, is there something that I could be doing or taking advantage of or donating money here, or like taking, is there some energy credit, or, they're familiar with all the different credits and deductions. And it's more up to you if you want to share with them that you're refusing to pay. Maybe in the past, they also like electronically filed for you and submitted all of your information so they could take the money out. If someone thought that their accountant might take it the wrong way, or it might irk them, you could simply ask, like, once you've filled out my tax forms for me, like, I'd prefer them to be printed out. I want to send them in on paper this year. And they'll probably won't understand why you'd ever want to do that, but they'll probably just assume you're that quirky person they do taxes for. And but so all that to say, I don't think it matters. Even if someone was an accountant who was a war tax resistor, they're not going to be able to, um, or if they're not going to be able to get your taxes lower than another person. And unless they were connected with Nutric in some way and were familiar with what actually happens if you refuse to pay your taxes, like during my accounting education, I never learned anything about what would actually happen to you if you refuse to pay your taxes. It was just that question was never thought of.
Gotcha. Um, all right. There are a couple more questions, but we've definitely gone over our 15 minutes. So I think, is it okay if people reach out to you if they want to ask you directly? Because there are definitely some more good questions in the chat, but I want to let you go get on with your evening.
Well, if there, maybe if you think there's two more, if that
Okay,
works
we
for
can
you,
do two.
let's take two more.
Two more. All right. Somebody is asking, does anyone have good resources for socially responsible retirement investing? My sense is that even if a fund is labeled ESG, lots of bad companies can still be part of the fund, and I wonder if ethical retirement investing is even possible.
I wish I had this at my fingertips. There actually one of the someone in our network who's more into socially responsible investing wrote a great article about this maybe a couple of years ago. And one of the things they pointed out is even if someone was like, even if a company was in all the right companies, they might still be keeping while they have money kind of sitting on the side that they're not sure where it should go yet, which every mutual fund usually has. They usually keep it in treasury bills, which are essentially, just loans to the government for war. So there's maybe one or two mutual fund companies that don't let their like money sit in treasury bills while they're figuring out where to put it. But I'm sorry, I don't recall which company that was offhand, but it's on our website somewhere.
Okay. And then this might be kind of what was asked before. Assuming the IRS will deduct funds automatically if you file accurately, how can you be a war tax resistor? That's kind of what was asked before, right?
Maybe I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Assuming the IRS will deduct funds automatically if you file accurately, how can you be a war tax resistor?
I mean, I think the point is, um, as during the slideshow, we're talking about this tax gap of $500 billion a year that the IRS knows should be owed to them, but people aren't paying. And by their own numbers, they know that when all is said and done, for that tax year, they'll probably only collect about 10% of it. So again, even if you're a filer who files accurately and have a wage job, you might end up working somewhere for 25 years before the IRS garnishes you. Or at that point, maybe you're collecting Social Security. And so at that point, they'll only be able to start collecting the last 10 years that you still owed for. So again, there's no guarantee that they'll collect those funds. Um, but I think the hope is, well, we know that as a group, um, they won't collect all the funds. Um, but as an individual, it could happen from time to time. And the hope is perhaps they expend more energy trying to collect than they actually end up collecting.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I've learned so much. I'm sure we've all learned so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to educate all of us. And yeah, can are there places people should get in touch with you? The website?
Yeah, so people could email me. The email's hopefully pretty simple, nutric@nutric.org. nwtrcc at nwtrcc.org. Otherwise, on the website, also, depending on what area of the country you're in, there's, if you load up the website, nwtrcc.org, one of the tabs near the end is About Us. And the last option on the About Us tab is local contacts and counselors. So depending on where you live, there could be a war tax resistor that you'll see on that list. They're organized by state. And if you see someone who's near you, these are folks, they're war tax resistors who have, as I said earlier, have gone through some extra training so that they can non-directively kind of give counsel and advice and share their experience. And the biggest complaint that I get from these folks is that they don't get enough calls. Like, they went through this training and now they feel like they want to be able to share it. So again, they're just doing it out of their passion for war tax resistance and resisting US militarism, and they're very happy to talk to people and to volunteer their time in that way. So please, I would urge you to make use of them, especially if there's someone near you. And then that way, it's also a way to make a connection locally with someone who's a war tax resistor.
Yeah, I think definitely building kind of local communities to work on this together is probably the best way to go. There seems to be so much interest in it right now, and yeah, 100% agree that local is best. Um, all
Yeah.
right. Is there anything else you want to add before we sign off?
I'll just add, so if you do connect with one of those local folks, if for some reason they don't know the answer to something, actually, this past few weeks with the greater interest, I've gotten emails from them where someone will say, I was talking to someone, and so things will trickle up to me. And then, as I mentioned, we do have legal counsel who's helped us out um, when there's things that are less common or we're on uncommon ground. So we kind of have this trickle up effect where if there's some issue that someone's having that I'm not as familiar with, then our lawyer is very happy to help us out and provide the appropriate answer. So please feel free to make use of folks, and we can always, as a community and as a network, we're there to kind of be resources for each other.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much to everyone who's joined us tonight. And if you're watching this in the future on the recording, I apologize for not being able to send out the YouTube link to everyone. Gmail cut me off after like 200 emails. So um, hopefully this finds its way to the people who want it. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.